Hello and welcome to Frags Radio Live. I'm your host Xamot, also known as Trevor. I'm going to check the volume again real quick to make sure everything seems to be working. So hopefully you guys can hear me. Sorry for the late start. I was, had to take care of a couple things right after I got home from work and get this sorted out. But anyway, so tonight I wanted to talk about. I was thinking about Endgame and I want to talk about Endgame, but I also want to talk about some of the confusion about timelines and time travel and Steve and Nebula and all the other things. I think I figured it out. Maybe not what they intended, but what seems the most logical explanation for all of that to me anyway. And then I also want to real quick take a minute to talk about. Sorry, I'm getting some stuff arranged. I'm just last minute really rushing around trying to get things sorted out for you here. So anyway, actually, if you're new to Frags Radio, this is sort of the show where I talk about geek stuff. We used to do this show a couple years ago. We'd have guest hosts on. We talk about all kinds of different things in pop culture, technology, and science, and all kinds of stuff. But I really wanted to break it down into some positive things that I enjoy in geekdom and pop culture and our sort of sphere of enjoyment of things, and share those positive things out there with you. I usually talk about comic books. For the most part, I don't have anything new this week. Nothing that you haven't seen before. I did get a new issue of Witchblade and a new issue of Kick-Ass, which was very good. I haven't read the Witchblade yet. I did get a free issue of West Coast Avengers, which we'll flip through real quick. We're going to do the comic books first, because Endgame is really the big thing here. So the West Coast Avengers comic book that I got, issue number 10. I get free. I don't buy Marvel Comics anymore. I stopped buying Marvel Comics a couple years back, and anybody who's followed me long enough, you know why. If you need an explanation, drop something in the comments or ask why. But there's plenty of articles out there on my sites and comments on Twitter and whatnot as to why I dropped Marvel Comics. But my comic guy gets free ones every so often, so he gives them to me. So West Coast Adventures is made up of both Hawkeyes, Kate Bishop, and Clint Barton, and then Gwenpool, America Chavez, Kid Omega, which is Quentin Quire from X-Men, and then Fuse, who I'm not familiar with, but his name Johnny Watson is his codename Fuse leads me to believe that he is probably an electric user or a lightning user of some sort. The book is written by Kelly Thompson, and the artist is Moy R. I am familiar with Kelly Thompson's writing. She's usually pretty good. The art isn't terrible in this book. I'm actually kind of surprised. The art's pretty decent for new Marvel. I think they do a pretty good job. I haven't read this, so I don't know if the story's any good or not, but if you're still reading Marvel and you're looking for something that at least looks good, this kind of looks good. It looks like it might be an okay comic for Marvel, which honestly isn't saying a lot, but, there you have it. I also got this issue of Spider-Man City at War number 2 for free. It was thrown into my stack, and the art is actually really good in this. Let me see who the artist was. Artist Michael Baldini. I'm not familiar with him right off the top of my head, but he does do some pretty good. Let me see if I can find you a good splash panel here of comic book or from Spider-Man. So he gets the webs. I'm trying to get it without the glare off of my monitor. So it's not too bad. It's not too bad, really, the art. I don't know anything about the story. I'd probably be lost if I tried to read it because this is the second issue and I haven't read any of them. But not much in the way of new stuff from comic books this week. Sad news this week, though, and I want to make sure that we talk about it because I met Peter Mayhew a few years back when Wizard World up in Chicago. Sorry, I'm all itchy. Wizard World in Chicago had they always had a Star Wars panel, signing panel, and I can't remember what they called it, but it was always character actors from Star Wars like Peter Mayhew, Jeremy Bulloch, Warwick Davis. I met David Prowse at one of those, and we met Peter Mayhew I think the same year we met Warwick Davis, and both of those guys are wonderful people. They were really genuinely nice. They were decent to the fans. They were wonderful people to meet. Peter Mayhew especially was such a great guy, and he passed away on the 30th. The family kept it quiet, obviously, for a couple days to process everything and do what they needed to do, but they released the statement, I believe, yesterday. And he had dealt with health issues for a long time, and I know that he was it for The Force Awakens, he actually was in a wheelchair before that movie, and he worked really hard to get out of that wheelchair and be able to walk again so that he could reprise his role as Chewbacca. And later he started training somebody to take over for him. So we knew that his health was getting to a point where he was no longer going to be able to continue. But sadly, we lost Chewbacca, Peter Mayhew, at the end of April, which is a huge loss for Star Wars fans and for the Star Wars universe and in general. Such a nice guy, such a decent guy. He really seemed like he was probably very well loved. So his family, my heart goes out to them. Thinking about them, I know, it doesn't mean anything. Yeah, it means a lot to a lot of people. So I'm hoping that they are, that their grief runs its course naturally and without any extra burdens, and that they get through this all hale and whole. So that, yeah, real sad news, unfortunately. So now we want to talk about Endgame. So we got a lot to talk about. Endgame, first of all, it was really good. I really enjoyed the movie. Hold on. I made it all the way through, so whatever that no pee break badge of honor thing goes. I didn't get a soda. I didn't drink a lot before we went to the movie. I made sure I went to the bathroom a couple times before the movie, and I made it all the way through to the end. It is a long movie, but it doesn't feel that long. It's not like Dances with Wolves long, where it feels like a 3-hour movie. It really didn't feel that long. A lot happens though. There's really a lot to that movie, and there's a lot of things that people were confused about, but for the movie itself, it was great. The characters, they really from what I understand, they wanted to showcase the original Avengers, and they really did. They gave the original Avengers, hold on, I'll make sure this text isn't important. Okay. They really wanted to give the original Avengers their send-off, their glorious final stand, as it were, and each one of them is very damaged by the end of this movie, or in some cases gone. And there are going to be spoilers, so go ahead and warn you right now, if you haven't seen the movie yet and you don't want spoilers, we're about to get into spoiler territory. So if you just want to know if it was great, yes, it was great. I loved it. I really had a good time. It wasn't as exciting and, oh my gosh, inducing as Infinity War, but it was a wonderful wrap-up of a 22-movie saga. It had everything I was hoping it would have. It even had the ending that I was hoping it would have. Not exactly the way I expected it to be, but it was there. So if that's what you're here for, yeah, go see it. Take a look. Now, spoilers. We're going to get into spoilers. There was one eye-rolling moment, and to me it was really, I was surprised that Marvel went the route they did with the fight scene where all the women got together. And of course, some people out there are going to say, "Oh, that's because you hate women," whatever. So the big fight going on, you guys all saw it, and then Captain Marvel gets the gauntlet, and she has to make it across the battlefield, and I can't, was it Pepper said, "Don't worry, she's got backup," and then all the women get their wonderful fight sequence together as this big girl power thing. The trouble is that Marvel has never treated their characters differently based on gender, and then all of a sudden they do. It just seemed very out of place. All of these characters have shined in their respective roles within the MCU, whether it be Scarlet Witch's, super powerful. I mean, she had a great scene during that fight, and then interacted with other characters. And seeing Pepper Potts come in the suit that Tony made for her was really kind of cool. And seeing Valkyrie get her shot and work with the other Avengers was good. So all of them had this interaction that was really good, and then all of a sudden they just had to do this. I mean, it seemed like, you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of like one of those dance sequences in an 80s movie where all of a sudden everything stops that has to do with the movie, and all the characters start dancing together in, all in some predetermined routine that never happens in the real world. That's what that scene felt like. It felt like they stopped the movie and gave these girls, these women, a dance routine that only they saw and only they knew, dancing to music only they could hear, and then once it was over, it was back to the movie. That's what it felt like. It felt so out of place. And I really wish they had kept with their theme of really integrating all of these characters together and showing their teamwork and showing their diversity of powers and diversity of backgrounds and ideas and their strategies and their different ways of fighting together, because that's one of the things that I love about team comic books is when you show how two different characters with different powers might feed off each other or use each other's powers to overcome, different threats and everything. And this wasn't it. This was just like, let's just show how powerful these women characters are, which great, but can't you do it so that it feels like it's a seamless part of the story rather than some, quick dance number break that we're going to take in the middle of a fight scene? That's what it felt like. And it really but it wasn't long. It didn't drag on forever. So it was just kind of a moment of, okay, here we go. This is the moment where they I'm going to use the word. This is the moment where they pander to a particular demographic, who really, from what I've heard, it didn't come over that way either. So I'm not sure really if it came off the way they were hoping it would or not. But it wasn't that long. It wasn't a big deal. It was just the one moment in the whole movie where I stopped and went, okay, yeah, okay. Now on to the stuff that people are confused about. So the movie was great. I love the movie. The ending, I guess, yeah, before we talked about the time travel stuff, the ending, if you remember my show a few weeks back, I said this would be the perfect ending for Endgame. Steve and Peggy get their dance, fade to black. And I expected that to be a sort of stylized scene where Steve Rogers dies and he meets Peggy in heaven or the afterlife or whatever, and they get their dance. And that's not exactly how it goes down, obviously, but that's the end. And that was the perfect ending of that whole saga, because it sort of began with Captain America and Peggy Carter. Is that her name? Am I getting her name right? Peggy Carter. I may be getting her name wrong. I hope not. It began with those two sort of having a quick bond, because he comes up from such a small, literally a small part in the world to becoming Captain America, and she is sort of his connection to reality as he's going through being famous and doing the USO tours, and he's doing this and he's doing interviews and he's basically becoming like the most famous man in America. And then she's there to sort of be his anchor to reality, to the to what it is to be human, so to speak. And then the scene where he says they're going to have a dance, and then he goes off to fight, and then as the movie goes, in First Avenger, he gets frozen in ice and can't come back, obviously, to have their dance. So to see them finally get that was wonderful. Is a wonderful bookend on that whole saga, and the way to end that perfectly. And with no end credit scene, it just sort of not having the end credit scenes sort of respected that whole saga. It just said this is the final chapter, this is it, we're going to cut it right here, you know, and that was perfect. I couldn't have asked for a more perfect ending to the entire thing, that movie and the whole saga. It was just fantastic. So glad that they did that. So glad that that was the plan, so that we could see that final moment with Steve and Peggy. So now the part that's got people confused, and I don't think it's as complicated as everybody's making it out to be, or a lot of people are making it out to be, first of all. So the Russo brothers were asked, how did Steve Rogers get to that bench with an intact shield after young Steve jumped back in time? And the Russo brothers kind of went into this long, convoluted explanation about alternate dimensions, and maybe Steve Rogers can jump between dimensions and all this other stuff. And I think they were doing that so that, you know, if they gave a definitive answer on what happened, this is how it happened, then they would sort of paint every other writer into a corner who wanted to use anything from Endgame in future Marvel movies. So, and we know the Russo brothers have already said that they're not doing any more Marvel movies. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. They could always be, I mean, money talks. They might come back for more. But the answer they gave was a very diplomatic answer that a lot of authors will give when they don't want to paint themselves into a corner with especially something as convoluted as time travel. So they've sort of given you this vague gobbledygook workaround, well, maybe this, maybe that sort of answer, so that anybody can write anything that will fit into that sort of box that they've created, that very large, vague box that they've created. But I don't think it's that complicated. So follow with me here. The Steve Rogers part's the easy part. That's really the easy part. So there's two rules in Endgame's time travel theory, in their theory here. There's two rules that they set in the movie, and only two, which makes this actually easy. The more I thought about it, the easier it makes this. So rule number one, you can't change the future or your present by going into the past. It's already happened, so you can't change it. That's rule number one, and that's a pretty basic rule. It doesn't always make a lot of sense, because how can something exist that you maybe went back and killed? But they talked about that when Banner said, you know, when they were saying, well, we could just go back in time and kill baby Thanos, but you can't, because it's already happened. So you can't change the course of history by going back in time and doing something like that. I don't know how that makes sense, because if you kill baby Thanos, then he doesn't grow up to become big Thanos. But that's rule number one. You cannot change your present. Rule number two, set by the Ancient One. Whenever, and this is important, her specific references are very important here. Whenever you take an Infinity Stone out of the timeline, you create an alternate timeline. You create an alternate dimension that continues on from that point and may be impacted by the removal of an Infinity Stone. Okay, so she explained it very similar to how Doc Brown explained time travel in Back to the Future 2, but she basically said from the point in time you remove the time stone, or in this case the time stone, but an Infinity Stone, when you remove it, it creates a divergent timeline. So their current timeline will keep going because you can't change that. Creates a new timeline that's going to go off and do whatever happens without a time stone. And her concern was, without the time stone, then Dormammu couldn't be defeated, and then other really bad things would happen. So those are your two rules, the only two that they ever specify in this whole thing. So follow me now. So Steve has to go back and put the time stones back in the exact place where they took him out of, to sort of cut the branches, to eliminate the alternate timelines, to fix all of those. He has to put those those Infinity Stones back where they got them, exactly where they got them. He also takes Mjolnir back to give it back, because if Thor doesn't have Mjolnir, then he's got to fight without it. But we don't know that for sure, because you can't change your present by going into the past. So when they went in the past and Thor took Mjolnir from Valhalla and came forward, technically he didn't change anything, so I don't know how that works. Did 2 suddenly exist? I don't know. When he left, did Mjolnir get split in 2? I don't know. So I'm not entirely certain that Steve had to put Mjolnir back. It's just it's implied. It's implied that he had to take it with him. Okay. So Steve goes back and he sets all the stones. We have to assume he put all the stones back in the right place. Because that's Steve. He wouldn't fail at that, because that would just be another movie. So Steve Rogers, he put all the stones back in the right spot. And then he landed, I think, sometime after young Steve went into the ice. So he shows up sometime in the 40s, after World War II, after he's locked in the ice. And now they all know he was lost. He can't just show up on Peggy's doorstep and be like, hey, I'm back. Because, and there's a reason why I don't think he could do that, or why he would do that. So I think he went to her in secret and said, look, this is what's going down. We need to keep this a secret, but I wanted to get my last dance, see where it goes. If you can keep this a secret, let's see where it goes. So he keeps it a secret. So you've got future Steve in about 47, 48, living with Peggy in secret, in hiding. And nobody's looking for him, because they all know Steve is lost. If he grew his beard out and he wore a hat a lot, I mean, back then hardly anybody wore beards like that. You know, every man, every businessman, every respectable man shaved, so he could easily hide out. Nobody would know it was him. And he continues along. Now, he can't change what's going to happen with Steve coming out of the ice in the 2000s and joining the Avengers and all that stuff. You can't change that. It's already happened. So he has to live in secret, though, because otherwise it could cause other problems. It can't change things, but you can't have 2 Steve Rogers running around. Now, the SHIELD thing. We know at the time, during Captain America First Avenger, as far as we knew, that was all the vibranium there was, right? They made a shield out of, as far as I remember, they made a shield out of all the vibranium there was. So Steve had to fix the one he went back with because it was broken. So he knows there's more vibranium, but nobody else does. Who knows? A million different things could have happened for him to find more. Maybe he got in contact with some people who could find more. Maybe they found a node somewhere in Africa that split off after the asteroid crashed. Who knows how he got an intact shield forward when he showed up at the bench, but he did, and we don't really need to know why. We just know he did. So that's easy to explain. There is no separate timeline, because separate timelines, remember the second rule, you create a second timeline when you remove an Infinity Stone from the timeline. Steve didn't remove any, he put them all back. So Steve going back in time did not create a second timeline, not according to Marvel's rules, not according to the Endgame rules. It didn't create a second timeline. So there were 2 Steves going through time, a younger Steve and an older one. So when younger Steve did all his fighting and he did Infinity War and he did Endgame and then he jumped back, you just have future Steve, who shows up at the bench and sits down and gives back Falcon the shield. All well and good. Perfectly explained. I don't think the Russo brothers' explanation, I think it was so complicated, and intentionally so that other writers could do whatever they wanted with that story from that point forward. So then the second question, Nebula. You have 2 Nebulas. The future Nebula kills her past self. How does she continue to exist? Other question, how does Gamora continue to exist, because Gamora died? So if young Gamora comes to the future after, so you get all these questions, right? Starting to get confused. I don't think it's that confusing, so let's roll that one back too. War Machine and Nebula go get the stone before Quill can show up and get it, right? When did they take Nebula from that planet? As soon as War Machine took the stone into the future. So the second that War Machine jumped, He hit his thing, he jumped to the future, and Nebula hit her thing, and she didn't go anywhere. The moment he took the stone out of that timeline, it created a separate timeline. They grabbed Nebula, put her on the ship. They're in a separate timeline now. So their original timeline is continuing along just fine. Nebula, Gamora, Thanos doing their thing, Guardians of the Galaxy, blah, blah, blah. That's all going on just fine and good. It has to, because Thanos still has to get the Infinity Stones, and he still has to do the stuff in Infinity War and all of that. So that's going along here. All those people still exist along the normal timeline, because we created a separate timeline when we took the stone out. So now in the separate timeline, they do their stuff to Nebula, they do the switch, Thanos jumps through time, and now he's after he went to that other planet and they killed him. He comes back. So now you have Nebula and Gamora and Thanos and the other Nebula. Well, no, you have the Nebula from the other timelines already there, and you have Thanos and Gamora from the other timeline, the separate dimension, that show up, bringing the present Nebula with them. So when she shot herself, she wasn't shooting her past self anymore. She was shooting a Nebula from a different dimension. So when she killed her, she didn't cease to exist, right? And Gamora can exist now because she's the Gamora from a different timeline. And Thanos. So Thanos is dead. It doesn't mean he couldn't go back and do the other things because they can't change the present, right? It's a different Thanos. So you have to remember that the point in time where they take Nebula, the present Nebula, they've created a separate timeline from that point forward. So those people really don't, they matter, but they don't matter because it's all already happened down here, okay? So that makes sense? Y'all follow me? So it's not that complicated. Now, the really fun part, the cool part that I thought of while I'm doing this whole thing, and then I saw somebody say, but what about when Thanos destroyed the stones, right? Well, let's think about the MCU real quick as far as the movie goes. If you're a Marvel fan, you've read Marvel Comics, you know that there's the concept of the multiverse. There are thousands and thousands of dimensions. Like the comic book Earth is Earth 616, right? I can't remember. The MCU is actually a different dimension. And then you had the Fox universe where the X-Men and Fantastic Four and Daredevil or Deadpool live, and you had Sony's dimension where everybody else lives, right? So when Thanos snapped to destroy the stones, not only did he take the stones out of the timeline, but that power he used to destroy them could have created multiple, maybe thousands of timelines, of dimensions. So up until that point, the MCU has never talked about the movie. Marvel has never talked about alternate dimensions, alternate realities, other Earths, the multiverse. They've never talked about that. It's never really been brought up all that much, if at all. Even when we talk to the people from Valhalla, they never really mention that there are other Earths out there. But now we have to incorporate the Fox properties, right? We have to bring the X-Men in. Well, where have they been the whole time? Marvel has a couple options when they bring in the X-Men that they don't have with Daredevil. See, with the X-Men, they could reboot the X-Men. They could just suddenly have mutants happen. Suddenly mutants appear. But then you ruin some of the history. If you bring in the mutants, well, what about Xavier and Magneto that have been around for so long? They can't be if you just have mutants suddenly start to exist. Wolverine. He's hundreds of years old. You can't just have him suddenly start to exist or without completely rewriting those characters. So a reboot of the X-Men in the MCU and just kind of saying, oh, suddenly mutants exist, wouldn't really make a lot of sense. That would be a really crappy way of doing it, but they could. But they can't do that with Deadpool because they're not rebooting Deadpool. They're bringing Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool right into the MCU from what I understand. So that also means probably Cable. Which is going to be some great jokes when we see Ryan Reynolds and Cable and they start talking about Thanos and all of this. That should be really fun. But anyway, their other option is to bring the X-Men as an existing, or mutants as an existing, species into the MCU from another dimension, which now they have a perfectly good explanation for how the multiverse and those dimensions exist. By that, simply that snap, that destruction of the stones, and that snap could easily set the stage for the next phase of the MCU, saying, well, here's how the Fantastic Four got here, here's how the X-Men got here, here's how Deadpool got here. How does Deadpool never heard of the Avengers before? We had 2 Deadpool movies during the whole Infinity War saga, and Deadpool never once mentioned, well, obviously he can't because of licensing, but he never once mentions the Avengers. It'd be kind of weird if suddenly he knew about these Earth's mightiest heroes that have been around since, 2009. Be kind of odd. So this is the perfect opening for them to bring them in a way that makes sense into the new MCU with its, new universal rules and story and lore, without just breaking the whole thing. Because that's been my concern. How are they going to bring these characters into the MCU without breaking everything? Now they can. So that's where I'm at. That's what I think about Endgame and about the confusion around the timelines. I don't think it's that complicated. I really don't think it's that confusing. If you're still confused, shoot me a message on Twitter, or drop a comment on Facebook, or not Facebook, on YouTube, and we can talk about it some more. But I really think that is the most logical explanation for both of those sort of confusing plot holes, and the potential for the future of the MCU. I think hopefully it looks pretty good. I know there's some concerns about how they're going to handle some characters and how they're going to do this and that and everything else, but we'll see. We don't know. They are taking a break for a while. I think they're going to focus on the TV shows next, and maybe we'll get some movies that will come out of the next crop of characters. Who knows? I don't really know where we're going yet with the MCU. But Endgame was such a wonderful cap, such a wonderful bookend. So definitely go check it out. I'm planning on going and seeing it, hopefully sooner rather than later, but my schedule's packed. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Tomorrow we will be doing Saturday Randomness as usual, back with more Pathfinder Kingmaker. And then Sunday, I am at a show in Springfield, Illinois. If you live in the area, come out to the fairgrounds for first Sunday Midwest Bazaar at the Springfield, Illinois Fairgrounds. And that's about it. You guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow morning if you join me. Go see Endgame. It was a lot of fun, and I will see you next time. Much love.